Welcome to Grade 1 View, the podcast for future CRNAs by future CRNAs, a partnership between AANA and Beyond the Mask.
Whether you're about to graduate from a nurse anesthesia program, trying to get accepted to nursing school, or you're somewhere in between.
This podcast is a resource and safe space for all things nurse anesthesia.
We're your Season 2 host team. I'm Levi Davis.
I'm Kelsey Muir.
I'm Mackenzie Lane.
And I'm Nicholas Alexander. So grab your Mac or your Miller, turn up your flows, and get ready, because this is Grade 1 View.
Welcome back to Grade 1 View, the podcast where we navigate the highs and lows of nurse anesthesia school together. I'm your host, Mackenzie, here with Nick today, and we're going to be talking about tackling something that every single SRNA needs to understand before signing that very first employment contract, protecting our livelihood once we actually graduate.
Today, we are breaking down why malpractice insurance isn't just a formality or a box to check for HR. It is a critical shield for your clinical practice, your personal assets, and your professional reputation. If you think the hospital's policy has your back just because you're a W-2 employee, you might be in for a rude awakening.
To help us demystify the fine print, we are bringing in the heavy hitters. Today, we are sitting down with representatives from AANA's insurance services. Whether you are months away from graduation or just starting clinicals, this is mandatory listening before you put your name on that dotted line. Let's get that Grade 1 view on malpractice insurance.
Today, we have with us Brian Doyle and Lisa Kiska. Brian is the acting vice president of AANA Insurance Services. Brian has nearly 4 years of experience with AANA Insurance Services, where he leads the insurance team and helps AANA members navigate medical malpractice coverage and other insurance-related issues. Prior to AANA, he spent over a decade at AIG in a variety of commercial insurance roles.
Lisa Kiska is the senior underwriter and supervisor of underwriting and customer services for AANA Insurance Services, where she has worked for nearly 14 years. In her time with AANA Insurance Services, Lisa has worked closely with school programs and new graduates on their way to obtaining certification.
Thank you all for being here.
Thanks for having us.
We are excited to talk. I know for me and Nick probably is a little bit more familiar as you've started clinical, so I'm sure you are now insured for all that. I'm not quite there yet. But yeah, we just wanted to chat today about a general overview and then maybe take a few deep dives as well. So I guess to start, could one of you please just kind of lay out the basics for us? What are we getting into? What do we need?
So when you're looking for insurance, you want to make sure that you have a policy that's looking out for you particularly. So even if your W-2 job is covering you, you want to make sure you have something that protects just you and that you're not listed here as CRNA number 10, that you are listed as Mackenzie, as Nicholas. So you want to make sure that the policy you're looking at takes care of just you. And we can get into the differences in policy types and differences in coverage types as we go on.
Fabulous. Thank you. All right. And then Brian, what are a way that we as new grads and as students can kind of look at this, and how could we compare this to something we might be more familiar with?
Medical malpractice is a very complex type of insurance. It's also one that a lot of people never have to interact with in their life. I mean, I usually compare it to auto insurance. Everybody knows what auto insurance is. Most people have to have auto insurance. Med-mal is almost exact opposite. So auto insurance is very common. If you drive a car, you have to have it. Medical malpractice insurance, on the other hand, obviously only needed if you're a medical professional. Auto insurance tends to be a little bit easier to understand. If you're driving your car, if you hit something or hit somebody, you're going to need coverage. Medical malpractice is much more complex. It varies between specialties. Auto insurance doesn't. I mean, you can get in your car and drive all the way across the country. Your insurance will cover you wherever you go. With your medical malpractice policy, it depends on what you're doing, where you're doing it, and to a large extent, where you're getting your coverage from. Every insurance company approaches their policies a little bit differently. So you have to make sure that you read your policy to understand the coverage that you have. With auto insurance, that's not the case. You can buy a policy from pretty much anywhere and be sure that you have coverage. So another difference between the two are the way that claims come up. With auto insurance, claims are very frequent. If you think about your car, hail damage, hitting an object, someone backs into you in a parking lot, fender benders. Claims are constant. They're also very easy for insurance companies to predict because so many people have auto insurance. With medical malpractice, claims occur much less frequently, but when they do, they're much more complex. They're very expensive to adjudicate. They require legal experts. They require expert witnesses. Defense costs are very high. So it's much more difficult for insurance companies to put prices on medical malpractice policies than it is to put on auto policies. And that's also why you see premiums tend to change a little bit more, especially over the last few years for medical malpractice policies. It's very difficult for insurance companies to predict the way the industry is going to change. There's a lot of trends we see in claims now that differ greatly from what we saw even 5 years ago. So premiums shift a little bit more. It really depends where you get coverage is much more important for medical malpractice than auto. And I think that's a good way to look at it, to compare your medical malpractice insurance to something that most people are more familiar with, at least auto insurance.
So I don't know if this is a good or a bad thing, but when I was in the ICU, I never had any sort of insurance to protect me. So yeah, when I found out that I need additional things as a CRNA, I was like, oh gosh, another thing I have to worry about. Why, as students, do we need to start thinking about this now?
You want to prepare yourself so that you know what you're looking for and what you're looking at price-wise as you start to graduate, because that, like you said, it is another thing to worry about. It is another expense. At the AANA, we do try and help a little bit. We know that when you first get out of school, money may be a little bit tight, things like that. So we do try and give a 50% discount on any full-time or supplemental policy. So that does give you a little bit of break in your first year, 25% discount on both of those policies in your second year. But one of the things that you want to make sure you're understanding before you're getting that policy are the different things that matter, that consent to settle and the policy limits, what's standard for your state. You want to make sure that your policy includes defense costs so that if you are called into a deposition, even that maybe it wasn't a case that involved you, you want to make sure that you have representation with you in that deposition so that you're not, maybe saying something you didn't mean to say or saying something that could potentially even implicate you in that claim that you wouldn't have been named in originally. So you just want to make sure that you know the components of the policy and that you are protected as you begin your career on the right foot.
Fabulous. I didn't even know that was part of it, to have somebody come in with you to those arenas and everything, to kind of have like a backup person. That's super helpful and good to know. So as far as like Nick goes, he's in clinical now. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he has like a student policy through the AANA right now. Would that be correct?
It really depends on the program you're in. Mm-hmm. Some programs kind of handle everything for their residents to make sure that, everybody has the same start date, everybody has the same end date, everybody has the same coverage. Other programs kind of put it on you, get your own coverage. And then some programs do it for the whole class at once. So it really depends what program you're with.
Kind of jumping ahead to whenever we as future CRNAs are actually in the workforce, how does transitioning from a W-2 employee to a 1099 independent contractor change our malpractice responsibilities? Do we have to change insurance, or what does that sometimes look like?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And it's one, a lot of times we're seeing now students when they graduate going right to 1099 work, much more so than they did in the past. But when you're transitioning from a W-2 to a 1099, let's start with W-2. So if you're a W-2 worker, the hospital, the group, whatever facility you're working at, typically provides the malpractice coverage for you. So they'll pay your premiums, they'll handle credentialing. If you have something go wrong, they'll coordinate your legal defense, and they might pay for what's called tail coverage. We haven't really gotten into that yet. It's protection you need for a certain type of policy. I think we'll probably touch on that a little bit later. But as a 1099, you're much more responsible for managing your own risk. So when you start as a 1099, it's always worth asking, do you provide coverage? Because you might not be responsible. The facility might still provide coverage. If they don't, you're going to have to find your own. Even if the facility does provide coverage, you need to ask about it. So ask for what's called a COI, a certificate of insurance. It's going to give you basic information about the policy, what the limits are, if it's a claims-made policy or an occurrence policy. And you also want to confirm, since you're working as an independent contractor, you want to make sure that you're a named insured on the policy, meaning that your name actually appears somewhere. When you are a named insured, you have more of a direct contractual relationship with the insurance company. And going along with that, you're granted additional independent rights separate from your facility, which becomes important. If you're involved in a claim, you want to make sure that your interests are served, especially if they might diverge from the interests of your facility. Another big consideration, I mentioned this a little bit earlier, tail coverage. When you have a claims-made policy, the way that claims are reported is a little bit trickier. If you try to report a claim after the policy expires, you have to purchase what's called tail coverage. Tail coverage can be very expensive. Depending on if you're a full-time worker, it might cost upwards of $10,000 to purchase this coverage. So another important consideration as a 1099 is to ask if the facility will pay for it if you leave the facility or if you're responsible. It's important to know that's a big financial obligation. It's important to know who's going to pay for it. In the actual contract, there's a couple of terms in insurance. One's indemnification, and the other one's called a hold harmless agreement. An indemnification clause might be in the contract you sign when you start working. And what that means is you could be agreeing to paying your facility's legal expenses, reimbursing them for settlements, helping cover defense costs, or even assuming liability for certain claims if the facility is also involved. So you want to make sure that you look through the contract so you understand the relationship between your liability and the facility's liability. There's a provision called a hold harmless clause. And what that means is typically you agree not to pursue claims against the facility for losses that are covered by the clause. So I'll give you an example of that. If you have a patient that has a negative outcome, they sue multiple entities. Let's say they sue you as the CRNA, they sue a surgeon or physician, they sue the facility or the anesthesia group. Indemnification language in the contract may allow the facility to come back at you to recover some or all of the defense costs or the settlement contributions. So you want to make sure that you read that clause. A reasonable clause reads something like, you agree to indemnify the facility for your own negligence. That's a reasonable clause. If you do something negligent, then you most likely should be held responsible. Other contracts might have a much more broad clause that says something like, you agreed to indemnify the facility for any and all claims arising out of your services. That's much more restrictive. Then anything that goes wrong, even if you're within scope of practice and acting appropriately, you can be held liable for. And also, your insurance policy might then exclude coverage if you give too much away in the contract. So there's a lot of things that you want to look at. It's never a bad idea to even engage some kind of legal services or some kind of expert to take a look at the contract before you start, and also to look at the policy if the facility is providing it, just to make sure that you understand all of the nuts and bolts behind it.
Yeah, absolutely. That is also fascinating. Wow. Does the AANA offer anyone? I know you said we could go and seek legal counsel or someone to look over these contracts, or is that a conflict of interest for someone from the AANA to review it?
I'm not a lawyer, and I would not be able to give legal advice. So as far as the contractual review, we would not be able to help with that. The insurance policy, absolutely. Even if it's not through us, I can read it over, or I can even, if someone calls me, I just give them a list of questions to ask. Things like, you want to ask who provides the coverage? What's the insurance company? What are the limits? Is the policy claims made or occurrence? Who pays for the tail? Will you be a named insured? Things like that. Are defense costs inside or outside the limits? I'm sure we'll touch on that later. But I can give a list of questions. I've had some people send me their policies, and I'll take a look at them and compare them and contrast them to the policies that we offer through Medical Protective to point out maybe some weak points, things that you want to look at. We're happy to do that. So we're more on the insurance side as opposed to the contract side. That would probably be more of a lawyer or attorney.
Awesome. And then just a little bit more about the 1099, because I feel like that's such a hot topic right now. So as a 1099, you are the business. You as the person are the business. You had mentioned occurrence policies. How does that protect your business assets and allow you to maintain complete control over your career mobility.
Yeah, occurrence policies are considered to be much more friendly to you as the consumer. And in this area, there's two significant advantages they provide. First one is they protect your business assets, like you said. So an occurrence policy will cover any incident that happens during your policy period. Policy periods are typically a year long. Claims can take several months or years to be filed. So you might go do a procedure tomorrow, and 3 years down the road, you're notified that you're being sued. With an occurrence policy, as long as your insurance company is still in business, you have protection for the period of time that you held the policy, no matter how long in the future it is that the claim is brought against you. So it gives you a lot of peace of mind. You have permanent protection.
No tail coverage.
And no tail coverage. Yeah, that's a claims made policy where you have to worry about tails. Occurrence policies basically have an unlimited tail. No matter when the claim happens, you have coverage for that period of time as long as your services that you provided are within scope of practice. There's no tail obligation, and your protection's tied to your policy and not your employer's policy decisions. And if your employer merges or changes insurance carrier, if you have an occurrence policy, you have coverage forever. It also gives you control over your career mobility. When you have a claims made policy, every time you change jobs, you have to think about your tail coverage. Changing jobs means changing policies. And once a claims made policy ends, you can no longer make claims against that policy unless you purchase a tail. And like I said earlier, those can cost, it's basically like paying a second premium. If you pay $5,000 for your policy, if you buy a tail, it's most likely going to be another $5,000 to buy your tail. So it's very expensive. Occurrence policies, you don't need to worry about that. You can move between facilities, groups. You don't have to negotiate your tail coverage, and you aren't dependent on your former employee maintaining coverage or paying for a tail. So it gives you a lot more control over where you practice, and it's a lot less stressful.
I just want to add more about the tail, because that is something you definitely want to think about, as Brian's been saying. And a couple other things just that I also want to mention is, yes, it could cost like $10,000, but also you have a very limited time in which you can buy that tail. Sometimes it's 30, 60, or 90 days that you have to buy that tail in. Otherwise, it's no longer offered. So it's important to know how much that tail is going to cost and who's responsible for it before it's time to buy it. Because coming up with maybe $10,000 in 60 days, it could be quite difficult. The other thing is, depending on where you're getting your tail from, it could be a limited tail, meaning 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, or 5 years, rather than unlimited. And when you don't have an unlimited tail, you have to worry about things like, if you, let's say, worked on a minor patient today, that statute of limitations in some states may not begin until that patient turns 18. So if you had that limited tail of 3 years, by the time that patient makes a claim, your tail could be gone and you no longer had coverage for the time of the claim.
Why isn't it just all occurrence options then?
Yeah, it's claims made it's been around a little bit longer. It's much more friendly to insurance companies. And also if you go as a first-time policyholder and you get a quote for occurrence and claims made is going to be a lot cheaper. There's a reason why it's cheaper, and we're talking about part of it here. I think people don't understand the ramifications. Like, oh, I can save 40% by getting this claims made policy, but as you renew it, it becomes more expensive. So I think a part of it is just a lack of insurance knowledge. I mean, if you're comparing two things, they look like they're the same. There's only one little difference. This one says occurrence, this one says claims made, but I can save $1,500. Well, if I don't understand the difference, I'm going to purchase claims made. And I think that comes into it as well. Over a 5-year period, they work out to be about the same. Like if I have an occurrence policy for 5 years, the total amount I pay is about the same as I would pay for 5 years of a claims made policy, excluding the tail. So it's just sort of like a lack of foresight or information. That's why we try to get out there and share this information so people understand it. Occurrence policies are more expensive up front, but it's a set it and forget it. Once you purchase it, you have coverage for that period of time regardless. Like I said, as long as your insurance company is still around and financially solvent, even if they don't offer medical malpractice insurance anymore, as long as they're still in business, they will have to cover your claims. So it's much more consumer friendly.
I like that. I'm trying to take notes right now. And because I'm one of those people that even when I fly, I get insurance for my ticket, and so I'm a big fan. I'm like, even if it costs more, I'm like, I'm gonna get it. So right now, I'm like occurrence over claims made. How does insurance change depending on the type of model that we're practicing in? So if we're in more of like a supervised model or we're practicing independently, do we still get the same type of insurance?
Yeah, I mean, that coverage really is the same. You still need the same nuts and bolts of the policy where, you're still looking out for yourself. The same liability exists.
Okay.
Yeah, I know that there are. I mean, this is an issue we're constantly seeing. The physician supervision requirements in general are decreasing, and CRNA autonomy is increasing. This has a lot of positive impacts on CRNAs, obviously, their ability to practice it, but it also increases their exposure in ways that you need to keep mindful of. So if there's no one supervising you as a CRNA, you're much more likely to be viewed as the primary anesthesia provider. So if something goes wrong with the procedure, you're also much more likely to be brought into a claim. Standard of care might shift, and you as a CRNA might be judged differently. When you're an independent anesthesia provider, expert witnesses would judge you differently if you're not being supervised. State scope of practice laws become more significant. Our carrier that we use, Medical Protective, doesn't change their pricing based on supervision. Other carriers might. So that's another sort of a negative impact of increased autonomy, is that you might face a bump up in your premium because of that. Just in general, we're seeing CRNAs being brought into claims much more frequently. And I mean, I can't necessarily say if it's a correlation or causation, but obviously there's good things and bad things about increased autonomy. But one of the bad things is that you have increased liability at the same time. So you're going to be brought into claims much more frequently and also be held to a higher standard of care.
So if I am involved in a claim, or anyone is, I don't hope to be, but what are some things to do and not to do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll start with what to do. So documentation is extremely important. As you are working through your notes after your procedure, you want to make sure to take very, very good notes. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of times these claims will take several years, well, months or years to be adjudicated. Those notes that you take are your source of truth. So if you're doing procedures every day, it's going to be difficult to remember exactly what happened. So you want to make sure you document the patient file accurately and completely. You also want to notify your insurance company as soon as possible. A lot of insurance policies will have conditions that you have to follow for coverage to not be invalidated. And one of those is that you notify them when you think you're involved in a claim. And you also want to make sure to work with them. We've seen a few claims in history where the CRNAs were a bit difficult and were not as forthcoming in sharing information. Your insurance company wants the same outcome as you for the most part, especially our insurance company. You have aligned interests there. So it's important to provide them with enough information to document the situation and also give them what they need to help defend you or settle the case. And another thing that I think some people often don't think about is make sure that you're following any risk management rules or protocols that your facility has. So your facility is going to have a set of things that they want you to do if you think you're involved in a claim. It's important to follow those as well. Almost as importantly as what you should do is what you should not do. And each one of these three examples I'm going to give comes from specific claims that I've personally seen in the last few years. Do not alter your records. Really, you shouldn't probably even go back and look at them. So if you know you're being brought into a claim, I think human nature is you want to go back and see what happened. You want to go look at it. And while you're looking at it, you might think, oh, I meant to put this, or I didn't quite state this correctly. Don't do that. Everything has a footprint, an electronic trail that they can see that you edited it or went back to look at it. Do not do that. It just isn't a good look. Also, don't talk with other providers at your facility. We've seen a couple of examples where there were some text message conversations between a CRNA and maybe a physician, and those came back to negatively impact the CRNA and the claim. Very few conversations that you have at work are privileged. And I mean, I think human nature, if you're involved in a claim, is to talk to someone else who was there. You want to commiserate, I don't know if that's the right word, but talk to them, understand what happened, just sort of come to terms with it, because they were there, they understand what you're going through. You're probably very nervous, very worried. Human nature is that you want to talk to someone about it. As difficult as it is, even though they're a coworker and possibly a friend, it could come back to negatively affect you. So I would suggest strongly to not talk with other providers in your facility about it. And also, text messages are discoverable. I've seen several examples of text messages. I'm not going to give details here, but negatively affecting a CRNA as they came out in the court case. So, I mean, there's a lot of things to do. I think those are some that people normally don't think of that I point out. I don't know, Lisa, if you have anything else you want to add.
One of the things is, especially we find when you're in like a smaller facility where you know your patients very well and something happens, maybe a dental facility, an eye facility, those are most common, where you just want to help. So you talk to the patient and you're offer like, I'll pay for you to get an x-ray. You cannot do anything like that, because the second you give even a cent to them, you've admitted guilt. And now your insurance company won't be able to help you anymore because they are not the ones defending that claim anymore. You've already taken responsibility for it. So you really, even if you are attached to the patient, close with the patient, once there's some sort of claim or adverse incident, you want to cease communication.
Yeah, I think in general, it's important insurance companies handle claims every day, and they are experts at it. They have our insurance company, at least, has legal experts in every city around the country that they use. They have attorneys in every city that they use, expert witnesses. They are a very good resource for you. And like I said, for the most part, your interests align. So contact your insurance company early. Let them guide you through it. I mean, you might think that you will try to make it better, but it's very easy, like Lisa's example, to inadvertently do a good thing and make your situation worse. So involve your insurance company early, follow their guidance, and be forthcoming with giving them the information. I think that's a very good approach to handling any claim that you're involved in.
If I wanted to go out and purchase my own policy or like an additional policy in addition to what my employer gives me, because say I didn't like that one or something, how do I go about finding the best fit for me in an agency?
So what we offer is a supplemental policy. The supplemental policy is more commonly known as like a defense-only policy. So it has very low limits, and it is set up to have all of the bells and whistles that our full-time policies have, so that you do have that, pure consent to settle. You do have that attorney at your side and things like that. What could be an issue is if your employer does have a policy for you, and then you went and got a separate full-time policy, that could actually be detrimental to you, making you the deep pocket. So if everyone that you're working with, all of your colleagues, have limits of 1 million, 3 million, and you went ahead and got another policy because you didn't trust that one, you now have limits of 2 million, 6 million, rather than everyone else's 1, 3. So they'd want to keep you in the claim because you have more money to pay out. So that can be kind of a dangerous thing, actually, even though it sounds like more money, better, it could be a problem.
And to add on to that a little bit, I mean, one thing that Lisa mentioned is supplemental policy. It's important that, and I mentioned this earlier, that you want to see your name on the policy. You want to be a named insured. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But one main reason is that you're notified if you're brought into a claim. We've seen a few situations in the past where someone is a W-2 employee. They're covered by a policy that the facility purchases. They were named in a claim. A settlement was made. The CRNA was never notified. They went to change jobs, and boom, there's a claim on their NPDB report that they were not aware of. I won't say it's super common, but we have seen it happen. Lisa mentioned the supplemental policy that we offer. This is just another way for you to make sure that you have your own legal representation and you're notified if you're involved in a claim. Another thing Lisa mentioned is pure consent to settle. And I've mentioned a couple times so far about you and your insurance company having aligned interests. There is a point at times where your interests could become disaligned or unaligned from your insurance company. And that's when, let's say that you're you're sued by somebody and they get to a point where a settlement could be reached. So the plaintiff, the patient that's suing you, and your attorney come to an agreement. They come to an amount of money where we'll settle this. You don't have to go to court. Well, you as a CRNA have other considerations than just financial. You have your professional reputation to think about. If you are absolutely adamant that I want to fight this, I didn't do anything wrong, I acted within scope of practice, I don't want to settle. Because if you settle, like I said, that's going to remain on your record. And anytime you start a new job and you're credentialed, people are going to see that claim. So you might reach a point where your insurance company says, we want to settle it. We are fine paying this amount of money to make the claim stop. You as a CRNA think, no, I don't want to settle it. Our policy that we offer through Medical Protective has a clause called pure consent to settle. And pure consent to settle means that you have the right to refuse that settlement that your insurance company proposed and take it to trial, or I guess negotiate a different settlement, but usually it's that you want to go to trial to try to be acquitted. Pure consent to settle means you have the right to do that and you will not be penalized for it. Some insurance policies have what's called a hammer clause. And a hammer clause means if you reject that settlement, your insurance company will defend you in court, but any additional money that you end up being responsible for becomes your financial responsibility. So let's say that they propose a settlement of $200,000 and you reject that. If you then go to court and a judgment is made against you for $500,000, you are responsible for the additional $300,000 because you refuse to settle. That's the hammer clause. Our policy has pure consent to settle. And in the case with that, you would not be responsible for any of the $500,000, assuming your limits are higher than that. So it's one or two lines buried deep within your insurance policy, but it's a very important provision because, CRNAs, your reputation is your livelihood, and it's extremely important, and protecting that is often very important. So again, this is just protecting yourself where your interests and the interests of your insurance company might not be the same thing.
If I was in that situation and it was the pure consent to settle situation and I said, no, I want to go to court, I feel that I'm innocent, will the insurance company cover legal fees and attorney fees? They would have to? Okay.
Yep, they would. And we mentioned a couple times defense inside the limits and outside the limits. That's also something I think it's important to talk about. Defense costs for medical malpractice can be very expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So there's two ways that insurance companies handle them. Defense outside the limits means that any of your lawyer fees are paid in addition to your limits of liability. So if you have, Lisa uses 1 million, 3 million, that's a very common limit for CRNAs. You have $1 million to pay for any damages to a third party. If you have defense outside the limits, you also have basically unlimited funds to pay for your attorneys. If you have defense inside the limits, any amount that you pay for your lawyers counts against your limits of liability and erodes it or decreases it. So that's another very important consideration. Legal fees can be very expensive on medical malpractice claims, so it's important to know if those are counted against the limits that you pay for or not.
Gotcha. I want an occurrence policy and defense outside the limits. That's what I'm going for.
And pure consent to settle. Yeah, those are three things.
Pure consent to settle. That's what I want.
Yeah, those are the things I've been writing down.
Yeah. What if my employer doesn't offer that and I try to negotiate, hey, this is what I want? Is that worth walking away from a job?
I think that a lot of big facilities, big anesthesia groups, you really don't have much of a say. So asking the questions and knowing what you're getting and knowing what you have is very important. It would have to be a decision that you make for yourself. If it's, all the things on Brian's list that he told you to ask for and it doesn't fit any of that, then yeah, maybe it's worth walking away from. But if it's a case where, maybe 3 of those things fit what we're talking about and 3 of them don't, then that's why you would want that supplemental policy to have that backup in those instances. Unfortunately, a lot of times in those big hospitals and big groups, you don't really get much of a say to negotiate. You can try, and whenever possible, it's always best. Always ask, try to negotiate whenever you can hold your own policy rather than being on somebody else's, it's always the best.
So at the beginning of the podcast, you kind of talked about the insurance through AANA. Does the policy cover kind of everything we've been talking about?
Yes, absolutely. The policies through Medical Protective are the best. There's no better company. All they do is, malpractice insurance. So they've been in business for, I don't know, hundreds of years, right? And
125 years, yeah.
Oh,
125 years. Yeah. And it's a Warren Buffett company. I mean, they are very financially stable. It really is the best company, and that's why the AANA chose them.
what is one thing every SRNA should know about protecting their license before graduation?
That's a good question.
Yeah, it's a great question.
I think I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but your license can be at a greater risk than you would think from what happens outside of the OR than making a technical mistake with your anesthesia. So, and from conversations I've had, a lot of board investigations and claims result from issues like documentation discrepancies, failure to follow facility policy, medication handling, social media posts, professionalism, judgment, credibility. Those are all very important. So I think I would sum it up saying bad outcomes can occur even with excellent care. So what I've seen is boards often will scrutinize whether a CRNA acts honestly, acts professionally within standards of care before, after, and during the event. So it's very important. I mean, everyone can make a mistake. Everyone can have a bad outcome. But if you handle yourself in the proper way, you're a credible and reliable CRNA. I think that makes a very big difference.
And, Brian touched on it a little bit with the text messaging. That's such a big thing, especially, you guys are in the OR for so many hours with your colleagues. You become friends. You may want to send a text to them about the patient or something like that. Just avoid that altogether. The professionalism, keep that in mind all the time, because you may think it's no big deal, but maybe you sent a text to your friend and then something comes up. That text will be pulled into maybe the trial. So just always kind of keep professionalism as your top priority. Mackenzie, you mentioned early in the podcast when we were talking about 1099, and you said that you are the business. One thing I just wanted to add to that is a lot of times, if you have a financial advisor or colleagues that you're talking to, they will advise you to start a business, for tax purposes or whatever that may be. If you decide to do that, you definitely want to make sure you add that to your policy too. So just like you can be named in a claim, so can that business, even if it's only being used to write your paychecks. So just make sure you add that to your policy too, so that it'll likely be dropped from the claim, but you want to make sure it does have the defense to do so.
Right. Thank you for adding that. That's another thing I would have never thought of. Most of this conversation was things I would have never thought of. So I'm so thankful. So thankful.
Yeah, this was all way more complex than I thought it was. There's a lot to this.
You guys should give a talk at annual Congress one year. You should just have a whole presentation.
I did one a couple years ago when we were there. It seemed to go over pretty well. But we do a presentation to students a lot. I think we did about 20 this year to individual schools. But I mean, just in general, I think this is a good presentation. I mean, we were just updating our presentation. We got some updated numbers from our carrier Medical Protective. A few years ago, 90% of claims that CRNAs were involved in were dismissed. So no payment was made, no liability was found. They were dismissed. That number in the last 5 years has dropped to 65%. So what we're seeing is not only are more CRNAs being brought into claims, they're also not being dismissed nearly as frequently as they were in the past. So it's a very, I mean, insurance in general is a very important consideration. It's not just a requirement for a CRNA to work. It's also like a safeguard and a protection for your career. I mean, I know how much time goes into becoming a CRNA, and insurance just isn't something you want to skimp on. You want to make sure that you do your research and you understand it well. There's a lot riding on it. But in general, the claims environment is changing a lot. So I do think that these presentations are valuable. I mean, ideally, everyone thinks I'm never going to have a claim. Nothing's ever going to go wrong. But the moral of the story is something doesn't have to go wrong for you to be brought into a claim. So it's better to know the worst outcome that could happen and be aware of it. So if it does happen, you know how to handle it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I guess one last question that kind of made me think of, in a medical supervision practice, is the anesthesiologist always going to be pulled in if a CRNA is being sued since they were the supervisor? Or can they kind of be left out of it at times?
I mean, if there was supervision, I hate to say always, but I would think most of the time, yes. I mean, what we're
Mm-hmm.
seeing lately is that plaintiff's bar is just casting a very wide net instead of
Okay.
focusing on, like they might have in the past, a doctor. Well, if you focus on one profession and they manage to shift or deflect blame to someone else, well, then you're sort of out of luck. But if they cast a very wide net, then that has a much less chance of occurring. So I would say chances are pretty low, but never say never, I guess. But most of the time, yes, I would assume if they are being supervised, then if the CRNA was brought in, then the anesthesiologist would as well.
Interesting. Nick, if that's everything, do we want to
Oh,
wrap up? I feel like I
all
learned
right.
so much.
I did too. I was like, I'm gonna have to listen to this a couple
Oh,
times
yeah.
too, just so I can come back to it and
I'm
get
sending
all
it to my
these.
classmates, everything.
Yeah. One more thing I do want to mention is that insurance kind of begins while you're filling out the application for insurance. So when you're filling that out, you have to kind of remember that those are filed forms. They sometimes might have a little bit of legal jargon. So if you're filling it out and you answer something incorrectly, your insurance will be underwritten based on that information. So if you're not understanding a question while you're filling out the application, definitely give the insurance company a call to ask what that question means, have them explain it to you a little bit more. Because, if you answer a question, no, that should have been answered yes, your policy may be underwritten based on that no answer because the question was confusing. So we try to make our applications, as clear as possible. We go back and forth to try and make the wording more understandable, but sometimes it's hard to avoid. So if you're ever unsure, just always ask.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. And as we wrap up today's episode, I just want to thank Brian and Lisa from AANA Insurance Services for coming on the show and just pulling back that curtain on such a complex but super important topic.
If there's one thing I hope you take away from this conversation, it's that your license and your reputation are your most valuable assets. You've worked way too hard, missed too many holidays, and spent too many hours studying to leave your career exposed to fine print that you didn't understand.
As always, thank you so much for tuning in to Grade 1 View. Until next time, keep studying hard, advocating for yourself, and keep getting that Grade 1 view.